I think, a little dance through the sun-loving moth family called Helioselidae, which may not be known to many of you. They're tiny moths. Their wingspan is a few millimeters, and the giants in the family are a centimeter across, and they're day flying, so they're not often seen by people interested in moths. This is really a combination of some committed citizen science research and the efforts of an extraordinarily talented, hardworking PhD student who is now a postdoc at CSIRO, and that's Liz Miller. And I want a big shout out to Liz, and also a huge shout out to, I think, one of the best field entomologists in the country, and that's Andy Young. Andy has been collecting these moths for over 10 years, has collected 10,000 or more specimens, and compared with the 100 or so specimens that had been named in this family worldwide, Andy's managed to collect hundreds of new species. And I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the work we've done has been just setting an initial curation, understanding host plants, life history and ecology of the moths. And this has been really underpinned by a really robust molecular phylogeny that I'm going to use in parts to try and interpret some of the new results that we found regarding the role of Helioselidae in pollinations. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this talk, mainly the unpublished work of Liz and a number of other people who've been looking at pollination. This is the molecular phylogeny that Liz generated as part of her PhD. It was from 1,049 genes and 39 taxa that covered the diversity of Helioselidae across the world. And what we found was really neat was these different clades of moths that are coloured are associated with different plant families and different modes of life. So the green ones are leaf miners, and the kind of dark green one here is Heliosela, which is really abundant and diverse in Australia and associated with Myrtaceae. There's a new genus of moths that we found that are associated with Hibertia, and I'm going to touch on those at the end. They're flower and seed miners, the caterpillars, and this really extensive clade shown in pink that are exclusively associated with Rutaceae. And like the clade that feeds on Hibertias, the female moth lays her egg into the flower, and the caterpillars almost invariably start consuming the seed. What's both daunting and exciting about this clade is we've looked at about 15% of the Rutaceae species, the 500 or so Rutaceae species in Australia, and there are around 150 morpho species that we've collected. So, and that compares with the 4 that were named in the turn at the end of the 19th century. So again, I think there will end up being many hundreds or thousands of species of moths in this clade. I'm not going to talk much about the other clades that are associated with Rhamnaceae and a really extensive clade in blue, though there are only a few examples shown in this phylogeny associated with galls on Ericaceae. One of the interesting things we observed is that a typical micromoth abdomen is shown at the bottom here, and you can see it's covered with scales and it has an ovipositor. And what we found on a few moths that we were collecting was they had this unique structure, and it was at the dorsal tip of the abdomen, and in this case looks like a sort of V-shaped fly trap, and it was absolutely chock-a-block full of pollen. And that led us to start examining all of the moths that we'd collected to ask about pollination. And the sorts of questions we wanted to ask were, how many species are pollinators? Using the molecular phylogeny, how many times has pollination independently arisen? Are the moths polyphagous or highly host specific? Are the mutualisms likely to be obligate? And then from the moth's viewpoint, how is pollen collected and deposited? So lots of really intriguing questions about an almost unstudied family of moths from an Australian context. So there are the first answer is there are 3 groups of moths where pollination has arisen. Within that Hibertia genus, there are 21 species, all of which seem to be pollinators, and they, we think, all feed on seeds, and 5 other species that are morphologically different to the remainder of the genus are non-pollinators. They don't have pollen associated with their abdomen at all. And it's interesting, they seem to feed, the caterpillars seem to feed on the flower buds before they open. And I'm just going to show a video and some SEM right at the end of the talk on that group that feeds on the Hibertia, because we've not done a lot of work on it. The other genus that has pollinators is Celiastus, which is part of the Rutaceae feeding clade. And there are only 3 species where we see pollen associated with the females. And all of these species we think feed on seeds. And there are 68 species, all undescribed, that are non-pollinators. And then where I'm going to spend the most of the time is on a genus where there is only one named species. It's called Prophylactus. And we found 15 species that are pollinators and 45 species to date that are non-pollinators. But again, I think that this is probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of diversity. So Liz has created a much more extensive phylogeny of Prophylactus using 500 nuclear and mitochondrial genes and 160 Prophylactus and various outgroups. And we can start to draw some conclusions from analysing the host specificity of each of these different moths. And what's really stunning is that there is exquisite host specificity. So the moths have only one species of host plant. And you can see that because we color-coded the individual specimens here by their host plant association. So you can see each of these clades of moths in this phylogeny is made up of specimens that have one color and therefore are associated with one species of Rutaceae. The host plants, can be in Boronia, Cyanothamnus, or Zaeria. What we can also show is that the pollinators, which are shown here in pink up at the top of the phylogeny, are monophyletic and that they include no non-pollinators. And that suggests that within this genus, pollination has arisen once and we've not reverted back to the ancestral state within that clade, which is non-pollinating seed predators. Some, but not all, of the Boronia species also co-host non-pollinators. And in fact, there are species of Boronia that have a pollinator and 3 or 4 non-pollinating species of Helioselidae that are seed predators too. So there's some really interesting ecology underlying how each of those moth species interact with the plant. All of the Boronia species for which there are pollinators come from a single monophyletic clade of Boronia in WA, so a single section of the genus Boronia. And within this clade of Boronia, 2 species have 2 moth pollinators, 13 species have a single pollinator. We found no pollinators yet on 3 species, despite a pretty hard look. And there's 1 species that's found just in a very remote site south of Mount Ragged in Cape Arid that we've not yet looked on. Liz, working with Marco Doretto, has also done a beautiful job of trying to determine where there's evidence for co-speciation of this clade of Heliosellid and this clade of the clade of Helioselidae in Prophylactus and the clade of Boronia. And what we've done here is to label the Prophylactus according to their host plant specificity. And what you can see is, and she's done this with different types of analysis, is that there's good evidence to support the idea that Boronia and Prophylactus in these clades have co-speciated. What's also really interesting about this group of Boronia is that they have, there are examples of species here where the flowers are highly derived, much more so than far less related species of Boronia, indeed other Rutaceae. And Liz and Marco have looked at the various characters that are found in this group of Boronia, but found seldom anywhere else. And they're things like the size of the stigma, whether all of the anthers are fertile, their colour, their size, flower structures. You can see on the right in the pink flowers, these are pretty typical Boronia, very open flowers, pink petals, and no kind of dimorphism in the anthers. Whereas you can see there are some weird and wonderful structures here. Boronia megastigma has this huge stigma, some tiny yellow fertile anthers and these large purple infertile anthers. Boronia malloyae almost never opens and is just this closed turbinate structure. And these are Boronia tetrandra that have green flowers and some weird characters in their flower structures too. So one hypothesis is the coevolution of pollinators with the flowers has driven evolution of the flower structure. When you look at the moths, the structures that collect pollen are just, I think, beautiful and intricate and highly individual to each species of moth. So this is the structure of the tip of the abdomen of the moth that pollinates Boronia crenulata. This is the one from Boronia tetrandra. This is the one from Boronia heterophylla. And this is the structure of the moth that pollinates Boronia megastigma. Beautiful Y-shaped straight structure with pollen grains deeply embedded. What I'm going to show you next is a video of that Liz and some undergraduate helpers took of the moth pollinating Boronia megastigma. And in the peak of the flowering season, these moths are swarming around the plants. When you look at visitors to these flowers, 90% of the visitors, and Liz has done the counts on these, are the female moths, and they're the only insects that actually carry pollen. You can see at this point that the female moth is ovipositing. She's now finished ovipositing, and she starts walking across the stigma and flicking the rear of her abdomen where the pollen is with her hind legs, and then extruding the pollen in balls across the top of the stigma. And the idea, obviously, here is having laid her egg into the flower, there's an evolutionary advantage if she can maximize the likelihood that the flower is pollinated so that the caterpillars have seeds to eat. She then just flies off and then goes and lays into another flower. So that's really interesting. And I think there's a whole host of exciting questions that we can start to ask about how pollination has evolved in the different examples of Boronia. And what I like there is that we have examples that look like the moths play a relatively minor role in pollination all the way through to Boronia megastigma, where we think the moths are the obligate pollinator from some exclusion experiments that Liz has already done. I also just want to very quickly play a video taken by a citizen scientist called Marion Brugge outside Adelaide in South Australia. And this is a beautiful little moth in this undescribed genus, and its behavior on Hibertia is really interesting. It's doing this little dance, and what you can see, if you look carefully, is the moth drags her ventral side of the tip of the abdomen across the stamen. And then towards the end of the video, you'll see her start to spread her wings in a really characteristic pose and deposit her egg at the base of the ovaries. And I'm going to try and speed this up if I can. Here she goes. She's spreading her wings. She's trying to find the right spot. She's done another little dance, and then she'll settle in and oviposit. Now, there she goes. That's the oviposition stance. And she's got an extensible ovoscapt, and she's depositing her egg deep into the tissue. When you look by SEM at these moths, it is stunning. So you can see these amazing hairs on the ventral side of the abdomen, these long setae and the little hairs, and they are chock-a-block again full of pollen. If you look below, you can see the way the pollen is attaching to the hairs. So again, one of the interesting things about Hibertia, and it comes from papers that were published 30 or 40 years ago, is they have extraordinary floral diversity. And one of the authors of those papers 30 or 40 years ago were talking about the fact that they had more diversity than most angiosperm genera that they'd looked at. So trying to understand the relationship between floral structures and pollination in Hibertia and the roles the moths might play both in pollination and driving floral structures, I think is a really interesting question. And I just want to highlight again the people that have made this work possible. Most of us, this is not our day job. We do this as a hobby. And that's certainly true of Axel Calais, who's an immunologist at the Doherty Institute. And he and I have kind of made this kind of obsession for the rest of our life, outside work, much to our family's chagrin. A huge call out to Andy Young and Liz Miller, who have really been the brains and the intense field experts on this project, and a range of other people who've been super generous in the way they've collaborated, and especially a call out to many people who've helped organise permits in entomological societies, state and federal departments of environment, and a huge number of really generous local and history enthusiasts who've given us the benefit of their local knowledge of flora and fauna, have often let us stay at their houses, and also just to acknowledge the people that have supported the work. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks very much, Doug. Really fascinating. Anyone wants to, I'm sure Doug has plenty of questions to ask. be asked, but we might have to move straight on. Very, very, very grateful for finding time, Doug.